The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory in the spring of 1882. The small frontier town nestled between Red Canyon walls buzzed with the usual activity of settlers, miners, and ranchers going about their daily business. The sound of hammers rang from the blacksmith shop, while women in long dresses and bonnets hurried between the general store and the post office, their boots clicking against the wooden boardwalks. Samuel Harrison adjusted his worn leather hat as he guided his wagon down the main thoroughfare, the wooden wheels creaking against the packed earth road. At 34 years old, Samuel had the weathered look of a man who had spent most of his adult life working under the harsh desert sun. His calloused hands gripped the reins with practiced ease, and his blue eyes squinted against the morning glare as he surveyed the town he had called home for nearly 8 years. Samuel owned a modest ranch 5 miles outside Copper Ridge, where he raised cattle and horses on the 200 acres he had claimed after his discharge from the cavalry. The ranch provided a decent living, though it required constant work and vigilance in this unforgiving landscape. Today, he had come to town with a specific purpose that had been occupying his thoughts for weeks. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of Murphy's saloon, where several men had already gathered despite the early hour. Samuel tied off the reins and stepped down, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the ground. The familiar faces of his neighbors turned toward him with nods of acknowledgement. "Morning, Samuel," called out Thomas Mitchell, the owner of the largest cattle operation in the area. Mitchell was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with graying hair and a beard that he kept meticulously trimmed. His expensive clothes and gold pocket watch marked him as one of the more prosperous residents of Copper Ridge. "Heard you're planning a trip up to the Apache reservation." Samuel nodded as he approached the group of men. "That's right, Tom. Need to expand my horse stock, and word is they've got some fine animals up there willing to trade." A murmur rippled through the assembled men. Jacob Peterson, who ran the general store, shook his head with obvious disapproval. Peterson was a thin, nervous man who had moved west from Ohio only 2 years earlier, and he still carried himself with the cautious demeanor of someone who never quite felt secure in frontier life. "Don't know why you'd want to go dealing with them, Apache Samuel," Peterson said, his voice tight with concern. "Seems to me like asking for trouble. Just last month we heard about that trouble down in Tucson." "What trouble in Tucson?" asked Henry Walsh, the town's barber and unofficial keeper of local gossip. Walsh was a compact man with quick, darting eyes and an unfortunate habit of repeating everything he heard, often with embellishments that grew more dramatic with each telling. Peterson leaned in closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a dangerous secret. "Apache raiders hit a supply wagon train heading to the mines, took everything they could carry, and burned the rest. 3 men barely escaped with their lives." Samuel had heard the same story, though he suspected the details had been exaggerated in the telling. The Apache conflicts that had dominated the territory for decades were largely settled now, with most tribes confined to reservations. Still, tensions remained high, and many settlers viewed any interaction with Apache people as inherently dangerous. "That was renegades, Jacob," Samuel replied calmly. "The reservation Apache are different. They're trying to make an honest living, same as us." Mitchell snorted with derision. "Honest living? Samuel, you're talking about people who spent generations raiding and killing settlers. You think a few years on a reservation changes their nature?" "I think people are more complicated than their worst moments," Samuel answered, his voice carrying a quiet conviction that seemed to surprise some of the men. "Besides, they've got horses I need and I've got goods they want. It's just business." Dr. William Cartwright, the town's physician and one of its most educated residents, stepped forward from where he had been quietly listening. Cartwright was a man in his early 40s who had come west after the Civil War, seeking to leave behind the memories of battlefield surgery and the endless stream of wounded soldiers. His manner was generally thoughtful and measured, which earned him respect even when others disagreed with his opinions. "Samuel makes a fair point," Cartwright said. "The Apache have been living on the reservation peacefully for several years now. From what I understand, many of them are quite skilled with horses." "Skilled at stealing them, maybe," muttered Frank Coleman, who owned the local livery stable. Coleman was a gruff man who rarely had anything positive to say about anyone or anything, but his expertise with horses was unquestioned. I wouldn't trust them as far as I could throw them. Samuel felt his patience beginning to wear thin with the circular conversation. He had made his decision weeks ago and had not come to town seeking approval, merely to inform his neighbors of his plans as a matter of courtesy. The prejudice and fear he was hearing, while not surprising, still disappointed him. "Well, I appreciate everyone's concern," Samuel said, tipping his hat, "but my mind's made up. I'll be heading out tomorrow morning and should be back within the week." As Samuel turned to leave, Mitchell called out after him, "Samuel, wait a minute. If you're determined to go through with this fool errand, at least take someone with you. Frank's boy David knows his way around those parts, and he's handy with a rifle." David Coleman, Frank's 22-year-old son, looked up from where he had been shoeing a horse near the livery stable. David was tall and lanky, with the kind of nervous energy that came from too much ambition and too few opportunities to use it. He had been talking for months about wanting to see more of the territory, and the prospect of accompanying Samuel clearly excited him. "I'd be glad to ride along, Mr. Harrison," David said, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. "Been wanting to see what's up in that country anyway." Samuel considered the offer. While he preferred to handle his business alone, having company on the long ride might not be entirely unwelcome. David was young, but reliable, and Samuel knew the boy could handle himself if trouble arose. "Appreciate the offer, David," Samuel replied. "Be ready to ride at dawn. We'll likely be gone 4 or 5 days, maybe a week if the trading takes longer than expected." The group of men dispersed as the morning wore on, each returning to their respective businesses and concerns. Samuel completed his errands in town, purchasing supplies for the journey and checking his mail at the post office. The postmaster, elderly George Hartwell, handed him a letter from his sister back in Missouri, along with the latest edition of the territorial newspaper. Samuel tucked the letter into his vest pocket to read later and glanced through the newspaper headlines as he walked back to his wagon. Most of the news was political, discussing the ongoing debates about territorial statehood and the latest developments in the growing railroad network. One smaller article caught his attention, describing efforts by the federal government to encourage Apache people to adopt European-style farming and animal husbandry. The wagon ride back to his ranch gave Samuel time to think about the journey ahead. The Apache reservation was located roughly 60 miles northeast of Copper Ridge in mountainous country that Samuel knew only by reputation. The route would take them through several small settlements and trading posts, then into increasingly rugged terrain as they approached the reservation boundaries. Samuel's ranch house was a sturdy adobe structure he had built himself, with thick walls that provided relief from both summer heat and winter cold. The house consisted of 4 rooms, a large main room that served as kitchen and parlor, 2 bedrooms, and a small room he used as an office and storage space. Behind the house stood a barn, several corrals, and a bunkhouse for the seasonal workers he hired during roundup and branding time. As Samuel unhitched his horses and saw to their care, he mentally reviewed the preparations still needed for tomorrow's departure. His pack horse would carry trade goods, blankets, metal tools, ammunition, and several bottles of whiskey. He had heard that Apache craftsmen produced excellent leatherwork and pottery, items that might sell well in Copper Ridge or could be shipped east to larger markets. The evening meal was simple fare: salt pork, beans and coffee strong enough to dissolve horseshoes. Samuel ate alone, as he had for most of his adult life. He had been married once, briefly, to a schoolteacher named Margaret, whom he had met during his cavalry service in Kansas. Margaret had lasted exactly 4 months on the ranch before deciding that frontier life was not for her. She had returned to her family in St. Louis, and Samuel had received divorce papers 6 months later. After supper, Samuel sat on his front porch and read his sister's letter by the light of a kerosene lamp. Mary wrote about her children's school activities and her husband's expanding dry goods business in Kansas City. Her letters always carried an undertone of concern about Samuel's solitary life, and subtle suggestions that he should consider returning to civilized society. Samuel appreciated his sister's concern, but he had found a measure of peace in the Arizona Territory that had eluded him elsewhere. The night sky in this part of the territory was spectacular, unmarred by the smoke and lights of large cities. Samuel could see thousands of stars stretching from horizon to horizon, and he often spent his evenings simply watching the celestial display. Tonight, however, his thoughts were focused on the journey ahead and the challenges it might bring. Samuel had encountered Apache people during his cavalry service, though always in the context of military operations or tense negotiations. His experiences had left him with a complex understanding of a culture that was frequently misrepresented in newspapers and popular stories. The Apache were indeed formidable warriors when defending their homeland, but they were also skilled craftsmen, devoted family members, and people with a deep spiritual connection to the land they had inhabited for centuries. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of another scorching day once the sun climbed higher in the sky. Samuel was up before first light, checking his gear and loading the pack horse with trade goods. David Coleman arrived promptly at dawn, leading a sturdy bay gelding and carrying a well-maintained rifle across his saddle. "Morning, Mr. Harrison," David said, his voice betraying excitement despite his attempt to appear nonchalant. "Ready for whatever we might find out there." Samuel nodded and swung into his saddle, a comfortable old McClellan that had served him well through years of hard use. His horse, a reliable chestnut mare named Belle, stepped out eagerly as they began the long ride toward the reservation. The first day's travel took them through familiar country, past several small ranches and a mining camp where men were working a played-out silver claim with more optimism than sense. They made camp that evening near a reliable water source, sharing a simple meal and discussing the route ahead. "You ever dealt with Apache before, Mr. Harrison?" David asked as they sat around their small campfire. Samuel poked at the flames with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. "Some during my army days. Most of what people think they know about Apache comes from newspaper stories and barroom talk. Reality's usually more complicated. My father says they're all natural-born killers who can't be trusted," David said, though his tone suggested he was testing the idea rather than stating his own firm belief. "Your father's a good man, David, but he's letting fear do his thinking for him," Samuel replied. "I've known plenty of white men who were natural-born killers too. Being dangerous doesn't make someone evil, and being different doesn't make them less human." They reached the trading post at Willow Creek late on the second day, a rough collection of buildings that served travelers heading to and from the reservation. The proprietor, a weathered man named Jake Morrison, greeted them with the practiced friendliness of someone whose livelihood depended on maintaining good relationships with everyone who passed through. "You boys heading up to the reservation?" Morrison asked as he served them plates of venison stew and cornbread. "Don't see many folks making that trip for pleasure." "Business," Samuel replied. "Looking to trade for horses?" Morrison nodded knowingly. "Well, you picked a good time for it. Had a couple Apache men through here last week. Said there's been some fine colts born this spring. Young fellow named Nalnish seemed particularly proud of his stock." "You know this Nalnish personally?" Samuel asked, interested in any information that might help with the upcoming negotiations. "Met him a few times over the years," Morrison replied. "Speaks good English, fought against the cavalry for years before the surrender. Smart as a whip and honest in his dealings. If he's got horses to trade, they'll be good ones." That night, as they camped under the stars with the reservation still a day's ride ahead, Samuel found himself thinking about the prejudice and fear he had encountered in Copper Ridge. It was easier to hate and fear people you had never met, to reduce complex human beings to simple stereotypes that justified whatever treatment you chose to give them. The final day's journey took them into increasingly mountainous country, with towering pine forests and clear streams running down from snow-capped peaks. The air was thinner here and noticeably cooler even in the afternoon sun. Samuel had to admit that the landscape was spectacular, with vistas that stretched for dozens of miles across high desert valleys and rocky mesas. They encountered their first Apache residents in late afternoon, a small group of men on horseback who watched their approach with calm but careful attention. The leader, a man of perhaps 40 years with long black hair and traditional Apache clothing, rode forward to meet them. "I am Guyan," the man said in accented but clear English. "You are the traders Jake Morrison told us to expect?" Samuel nodded and introduced himself and David. "We are hoping to trade for horses." Jake mentioned someone named Nilnish might have animals available. Guyan smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. "Nilnish is my nephew. He has been expecting you. Follow us, and we will take you to his camp." The Apache settlement was larger than Samuel had anticipated, with several dozen traditional dwellings scattered across a broad valley. Gardens of corn, beans, and squash grew in neat rows, tended by women and children who paused to watch the newcomers with curious but wary eyes. Horses grazed in carefully managed herds, and Samuel could see immediately that the animals were well cared for and of excellent quality. Nalnish proved to be a man in his early 30s with an commanding presence and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He greeted his visitors with formal courtesy, inviting them to share a meal and rest from their journey before beginning any business discussions. "Tomorrow we will look at horses," Nalnish said as they sat around a fire sharing roasted meat and a type of bread Samuel had never tasted before. "Tonight you are guests. We will talk and learn about each other." Tit. As the evening progressed, Samuel found himself drawn into conversations that challenged many of his assumptions about Apache culture and society. Nalnish spoke passionately about his people's efforts to adapt to reservation life while maintaining their traditional values and customs. He described the challenges of learning new ways of farming and animal husbandry while dealing with government officials who often seem more interested in changing Apache culture than helping Apache people succeed. "Many of your people think we cannot change, that we are frozen in the past," Nalnish said, his voice carrying both sadness and determination. "But we have always adapted to survive. Now we must adapt again, but in our own way, keeping what is important while learning what we need to know." David, who had remained mostly quiet during the conversations, finally spoke up. "What's it like living here on the reservation? I mean, compared to how things were before?" Nalnish considered the question carefully. "Different. Not all good, not all bad. We have peace now, which is precious after so many years of fighting. Our children can grow up without fear of soldiers coming to destroy our homes. But we must live where the government tells us to live, and sometimes their rules make no sense for our way of life." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics from horse breeding techniques to the complex relationships between different Apache bands and their ongoing negotiations with federal officials. Samuel found himself genuinely impressed by Nalnish's intelligence and thoughtful approach to the enormous challenges his people faced. The next morning brought the serious business of horse trading. Nalnish led Samuel and David to several different herds, explaining the bloodlines and characteristics of various animals. Samuel's experienced eye told him that these were indeed exceptional horses, with the kind of hardy constitution and intelligent temperament that made them ideally suited to ranch work. "This mare here," Nalnish said, indicating a beautiful bay with distinctive white markings. "She is daughter of a horse my grandfather captured from Mexican soldiers 20 years ago. Very fast, very smart, very loyal to her rider." Samuel examined the mare carefully, noting her conformation, the clarity of her eyes, and the way she responded to human contact. Everything he saw confirmed Nalnish's assessment. The horse was clearly worth far more than anything Samuel had brought to trade. "She's magnificent," Samuel said honestly, "but I'm not sure I brought enough trade goods to match her value." Nalnish smiled. "We will find a way to make fair trade. Perhaps you have something else of value." The negotiations continued through most of the day, with Samuel ultimately selecting 4 horses that would significantly improve his breeding program. The trade goods he had brought proved sufficient for 3 of the animals, but the 4th, the exceptional bay mare Nalnish had shown him first, remained beyond his reach. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel found himself reluctant to leave without the mare, knowing he might never again encounter such a fine animal. He was considering what additional payment he might be able to arrange when a commotion arose from another part of the settlement. A group of Apache men rode into camp, leading a horse that was clearly in distress. As they drew closer, Samuel could see that the animal had suffered a severe injury to its right foreleg, and the wound appeared to be several days old with signs of infection setting in. "This is my daughter's horse," explained an older Apache man whom Samuel had met briefly the previous evening. "She was riding in the mountains when he stepped in a prairie dog hole. The leg is badly broken and the wound has turned bad." Samuel approached the injured horse, his experience with cavalry animals giving him insight into the severity of the injury. The break was complicated, and the infection was advancing rapidly. Without immediate and skilled treatment, the horse would likely have to be destroyed to end its suffering. "The bone is broken in 2 places," Samuel observed quietly to Nalnish, "and the infection is spreading fast. In another day or 2 it'll be too late to save him." As they discussed the horse's condition, a young Apache woman approached the group. Samuel estimated her age at perhaps 19 or 20 years, with the kind of natural grace and quiet confidence that suggested someone comfortable in her own skin. Her long black hair was adorned with small silver ornaments, and her traditional dress was decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of considerable skill and artistry. "This is my daughter, Ayana," said the older man, pride evident in his voice despite his concern for the injured horse. "She has been caring for this animal since he was a colt." Ayana looked at the injured horse with obvious distress, then turned her attention to Samuel with intense, intelligent, dark eyes. "You know about healing horses?" she asked in accented but clear English. Samuel nodded slowly. "Some. I've treated similar injuries during my cavalry service. It's possible to save him, but it would require surgery to set the bone properly and strong medicine to fight the infection." "You would do this?" Ayana asked, her voice carrying both hope and skepticism. Samuel looked at the suffering animal, then at the young woman, whose obvious love for the horse was written across her face. "I'd be willing to try, but I'll need help and the right supplies, and I can't guarantee success." What happened next surprised everyone, including Samuel himself. Without fully understanding why, he heard himself making an offer that would change the course of his life and the lives of everyone around him. "I'll tell you what," Samuel said, looking directly at Nalnish and then at Ayana's father. "If I can save this horse, and if your daughter is willing, I'll take her back to Copper Ridge to work with my horses. She can learn more about horse doctoring and breeding techniques, and I can learn Apache methods from her. It would be temporary, maybe a few months, just long enough for both of us to benefit from the exchange." The suggestion fell into the conversation like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of surprise and consideration that spread through the assembled Apache people. Samuel himself was surprised by his offer, but something about the young woman's obvious skill with horses and the desperate situation of the injured animal had prompted him to make a proposal that went far beyond anything he had planned. Ayana looked at her father, then at Nalnish, then back at Samuel. Her expression was unreadable, but Samuel could sense the wheels turning in her mind as she considered the unexpected possibility. "You would teach me white man's medicine for horses?" she asked finally. "Everything I know," Samuel replied, "and you could teach me Apache methods. I've heard your people have ways with horses that most whites don't understand." Ayana's father, whose name Samuel learned was Nantan, spoke rapidly in Apache to Nalnish and several other men who had gathered around the conversation. Samuel could not understand the words, but the tone suggested serious consideration rather than immediate rejection of the idea. "This is not a decision to be made quickly," Nantan said finally. "We must talk among ourselves, and Ayana must decide for herself. But first, you must show that you can do what you promise with the injured horse." Samuel nodded, understanding that he was being tested in multiple ways simultaneously. The success or failure of his treatment would determine not only the fate of the injured animal, but also the possibility of the cultural exchange he had impulsively proposed. The remainder of the afternoon was spent in careful preparation for the surgical procedure. Samuel examined his medical supplies, finding that he had most of what he would need, but lacking some important items. Fortunately, Nalnish was able to provide several traditional Apache remedies that Samuel had never encountered, but which proved to be remarkably effective. As word spread through the settlement about the proposed surgery, more and more people gathered to observe. Samuel found himself working under the scrutiny of dozens of Apache men, women, and children, all of whom seemed intensely interested in his methods and capabilities. The surgery itself was delicate and time-consuming work. Samuel had to carefully clean the infected wound, realign the broken bones, and create a splint system that would hold everything in place while healing occurred. Throughout the procedure, Ayana assisted with steady hands and an obvious understanding of both horse anatomy and the principles of medical treatment. "Where did you learn so much about horse doctoring?" Samuel asked as they worked together to position a difficult splint. "From my grandfather, and from watching the horses themselves," Ayana replied, without looking up from her work. "Animals know how to heal if you give them the chance and don't interfere with what their bodies are trying to do." The wisdom in her approach impressed Samuel, and he found himself modifying his techniques based on her suggestions. By the time they finished, several hours after they had begun, Samuel was confident that they had given the horse the best possible chance for recovery. "Now we wait," Samuel said, washing his hands in a basin of water that Ayana had heated over a fire. "If the infection doesn't spread and the bones start to heal properly, he should make a full recovery. But it'll take time, maybe 2 or 3 months." Ayana nodded, her attention focused entirely on the horse, which was now resting comfortably in a makeshift stall they had constructed near her father's dwelling. "He will live," she said with quiet confidence. "I can see it in his eyes." As evening fell, the Apache leaders gathered for extended discussions about Samuel's proposal. The conversations continued long into the night, with various people presenting arguments and concerns, while Ayana listened carefully but said little. Samuel and David were invited to sleep in a guest lodge, but Samuel found himself too restless to rest. He walked through the settlement in the moonlight, observing the daily life of people who were still largely mysterious to most white Americans. Children played games that seemed both familiar and strange. Women worked at crafts that produced items of remarkable beauty and functionality, and men discussed the eternal concerns of weather, animals, and family that transcended cultural boundaries. The next morning brought Ayana's decision. She approached Samuel as he was examining the injured horse, which showed encouraging signs of improvement overnight. "I will come with you to your ranch," she said simply. "But there must be conditions. I will stay for 6 months, no longer. I will work with your horses and learn what you can teach me, but I will also teach you our ways with animals, and if I am not treated with respect or if I am not safe, I will leave immediately." Samuel nodded, understanding that she was taking an enormous risk by agreeing to leave everything familiar for an uncertain situation among people who might not welcome her presence. "Those terms are fair," he replied. "I'll do everything I can to make sure you're treated properly and that the arrangement benefits both of us." Nantan approached as they were finalizing the details of the arrangement. His expression was serious, but not hostile, as he addressed Samuel directly. "My daughter is precious to me beyond anything else in this world," he said with quiet intensity. "She is skilled with horses, but she is also intelligent and curious about many things. If harm comes to her, or if she is mistreated in any way, there will be consequences that reach far beyond this valley." Samuel met the older man's gaze steadily. "I understand, and I give you my word that she'll be protected and respected. If for any reason the arrangement doesn't work out, I'll personally escort her back here safely." The preparations for departure took most of the day. Ayana packed her belongings, which proved to be relatively few, but included several items that Samuel recognized as having significant personal or spiritual importance. Her father and other relatives offered advice, warnings, and blessings in equal measure, clearly torn between pride in her courage and anxiety about the unknown dangers she might face. Nailnish completed the horse trading by announcing that the bay mare Samuel had admired would be part of the arrangement, a gesture of good faith and confidence in the cultural exchange they were beginning. As they prepared to leave the following morning, Samuel found himself accompanied by not only David and Ayana, but also by two Apache men who would escort them partway back toward Copper Ridge. The gesture was both protective and diplomatic, ensuring that Ayana's transition to life outside the reservation began as safely as possible. The return journey proved to be far different from the trip up to the reservation. David was clearly fascinated by Ayana's knowledge of horses and her different perspective on animal behavior, while Ayana asked countless questions about white settlements, customs, and the specific challenges of ranch life. Samuel found himself serving as interpreter not only of languages, but of cultures, explaining white attitudes and behaviors to Ayana while helping David understand Apache perspectives that challenged many of his assumptions about Indian people. "Why do white people keep horses in small pens?" Ayana asked as they made camp on the second night of their return journey. "Horses need to move, to run, to be with other horses. How can they be happy locked up?" Samuel had to admit that her question highlighted a fundamental difference in approach. Most whites think about controlling their animals, making sure they don't get lost or hurt. Apache people seem to think more about understanding what the animals need to be healthy and productive. "Understanding is better than controlling," Ayana replied with conviction. "When you understand an animal, it wants to work with you. When you only control it, it works because it is afraid." The conversations continued throughout the journey, covering everything from horse training techniques to the complex relationships between different ethnic groups in the Arizona Territory. Samuel found himself learning as much as he was teaching, gaining insights into Apache culture and philosophy that no book or newspaper article had ever provided. As they approached Copper Ridge on the fourth day of travel, Samuel began to wonder how the town would react to Ayana's presence. His neighbors' concerns about his trading expedition had been focused on his safety and the wisdom of dealing with Apache people at all. None of them had imagined that he might return with an Apache woman who intended to live and work in their community, even temporarily. The first test came at the Willow Creek trading post, where Jake Morrison greeted their party with obvious surprise and curiosity. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison said, looking from Samuel to Ayana and back again. "This is a new one. You folks heading to Copper Ridge?" Samuel nodded. "Ayana will be working with horses on my ranch for the next few months. We're teaching each other different techniques and methods." Morrison's expression was carefully neutral, but Samuel could see the man's mind working through the implications and potential complications of the arrangement. After a moment, Morrison nodded slowly. "Well, I suppose that's your business," he said finally. "Just hope you know what you're getting into." And as they made camp that final night before reaching Copper Ridge, Samuel found himself reflecting on the decision that had seemed so impulsive when he made it, but now felt increasingly inevitable. Watching Ayana work with the horses they had acquired, seeing her natural understanding of animal behavior and her willingness to share knowledge while learning new approaches, he realized that the exchange might benefit both of them far more than he had initially anticipated. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Samuel asked as they sat around their campfire, with David already rolled up in his blankets and snoring softly. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on the dancing flames. "Yes," she said finally. "Your people do not know me, and many of them will not want me in their town. But I have decided to be brave, to learn what I can and teach what I can, no matter what they think." Samuel nodded, impressed by her honesty and her determination. "Some of them will be difficult, that's true. But others will come around once they see what you can do with horses, and I'll be there to make sure you're treated fairly. I do not need you to protect me, Ayana replied, her voice carrying quiet strength. But I appreciate that you want to help. We will face whatever comes together as partners in this learning. He turned as Samuel settled into his bedroll that night. He found himself thinking about the conversation that would surely greet their arrival in Copper Ridge. The men who had been skeptical about his trading expedition would be shocked by the reality of what he had accomplished. Some would undoubtedly see his arrangement with Ayana as confirmation of their worst fears about dealing with Apache people, while others might be curious enough to give the unusual situation a chance to prove itself. The success or failure of the next few months would depend not only on Ayana's skills with horses and her ability to adapt to life in a white settlement, but also on the willingness of Copper Ridge residents to look beyond their prejudices and see the value of cultural exchange. Samuel was betting that practical results and demonstrated expertise would ultimately triumph over fear and bias, but he knew the test would not be easy for anyone involved. As he drifted off to sleep under the vast canopy of desert stars, Samuel Harrison could not have imagined that his simple horse-trading expedition would become the beginning of a story that would challenge everyone in Copper Ridge to examine their assumptions about race, culture, and the possibilities for understanding between people who seem to have nothing in common. The morning sun would bring them home, and with it, the beginning of an experiment in cross-cultural cooperation that would test the limits of tolerance and open-mindedness in a frontier community still learning how to navigate the complex realities of a changing American West.